All right, you guys are fortunate to have such an active, what's your official title, program?
Oh, programs chair.
Programs director at the local historical society. So thanks to Dulcie for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here. Okay, so I do have some. This is going to be an image-heavy presentation, and we may have some tech problems, but hopefully Dulcie will be able to tell me when the screen goes blue and we can fix things. So. All right, so I plan to start this talk differently than I will, but as I was kind of finalizing my notes and thinking about this week in particular, the weight of a couple of historical anniversaries that are upon us caused me to kind of frame this a little differently. This week marks two monumental historical anniversaries. Well, one monumental and one sort of an odd year. It's like nothing's not like 100 or 150 years or anything, but nevertheless, anniversaries in the history of race in the United States. Next Monday, April 9th, I know it's technically not this week, but it's within 7 days from now, marks the 153rd anniversary of General Lee's surrender to General Grant at Appomattox, and official end of military hostilities between the North and the South in the American Civil War. And this all but assured assured the end of slavery as it was then institutionalized in U.S. society. In hindsight, as I'm going to talk about in this presentation, it also marked the beginning of a healing process between white Northerners and white Southerners, one that was not always smooth, but nevertheless, by the 1890s, had signaled the resubordination of black Southerners in particular, but black Americans in general in the United States. So that's the first anniversary that's upon us. The second one is a bit closer to our time. I think that Dulcie and I are probably the only ones that didn't live through the second one, and that one is today. Today marks the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was gunned down in Memphis, Tennessee, by a white supremacist. Dulcie, would you mind advancing the slide here? Okay. So King was in Memphis. He was poised to march tomorrow, 50 years ago tomorrow on April 5th, with striking sanitation workers. You see them on strike here. Previously, this was March 29th, so several days before King arrives in Memphis. And King had begun to, well, he wasn't the original organizer of these striking sanitation workers, but he joined their cause after two workers were crushed by their garbage truck compactor. They'd been instructed to take shelter from the rain inside the cavities of their trucks by the Memphis Sanitation Department. The sanitation workforce was nearly completely African American. And so this was, of course, right in King's wheelhouse as a civil rights leader. He'd addressed the strikers on April 3rd, so 50 years ago last night, and was killed the next day. I think it's worth reflecting on King, or the context in which King was there in Memphis 50 years ago this week. We're about to explore the deeper history of white solidarity and representations of white supremacy in the face of African American social, economic, political advancement after the demise of slavery. And in April of 1968, King was in Memphis to address these workers, again, as I said, mostly black, but nevertheless a multiracial public workforce within the city of Memphis and in other similar cities in the South. Come back. We're assured it will come back. He was there to lift up, in an economic sense, an entire class of of Americans, black and white and brown and red and yellow, all the sort of 5 racial categories from the history school books of the early 20th century, degraded by the most extreme and inhumane forces of American capitalism. The being crushed to death in a garbage truck, I think, qualifies. King had described them in his April 3rd rally the night before he was killed as starvation wages. His sanitation workers were on strike, not just for better wages, but to avoid being injured on the job by faulty equipment, other occupational hazards. Thank you. So in short, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, these were already in the win column by the time King was in Memphis, he turned his attention in the latter years of his life to economic injustice and to the war in Vietnam. As it turns out, April 4th, 1967, a year before he was killed, to the day, he identified what he called the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. This was in a speech called Beyond Vietnam that he gave on April 4th, 1967. So, in case you haven't figured it out, April 4th is a pretty important date as far as days go. We remember King quite fondly today. Only the most extreme racists disavow his importance, even if the less extreme might distort or misunderstand, sometimes intentionally, his message and his life's work. If any of you watched the Super Bowl, the Dodge Ram commercial that riffed on one of his speeches is a case in point. When he died in 1968, though, King was not a very popular figure for many Americans, including some of his inner circle of civil rights activists who thought that he'd gone too far beyond the original goal of ending structural racism in the American South. He was calling into question capitalism. He was calling into question the might of the American military. And this was a step further than many were willing to take. So he died, at least in this sort of popular view of him, a kind of ostracized or marginalized figure. We don't tend to think of him that way 50 years later. Many Northerners, in fact, who supported the fight to end segregation in the American South, felt uncomfortable, even threatened by his more holistic assessment of the ills of American society. So I think it's worth reflecting on his last days and the triple evils that he identified and sought to challenge given our current political moment. So the last generation of Americans, the students that sit in my classroom at WSU, those that attend the University of Idaho, they've come of age amidst renewals of these triple threats. A war on terror that doesn't seem to have a coherent set of objectives or an end in sight. The restoration of Gilded Age economic policy, and regular, at least monthly it seems, cell phone footage of unarmed African Americans being killed by either officers of the state or vigilantes. And so the triple evils that King identified 51 years ago and died combating 50 years ago are still with us. So I want to shift to one of those vigilante killings in order to begin our discussion of the relationship between Confederate symbolism and race in the U.S. Can we go one more? Okay.